You can buy a man's muscle for a few pieces of silver, but you cannot buy his mind back from the mud once the campaign is done. Every empire is a beautiful house built over a massive ditch full of broken teeth and rotting bones. The history books want you to stare at the white marble columns of the Roman Forum glowing in the evening light. They want you to admire the perfect lines of the marching columns, the golden eagles catching the sun, and the brilliance of generals who drew straight lines across maps of ancient continents. But maps do not bleed. White stone statues do not wake up screaming in the dark because their ears are full of the sound of a German warrior choking on his own blood 3 inches from their face. The state spent 400 years perfecting a machine that could turn farm boys into industrial weapons. It worked beautifully. It conquered the world. But the machine never had an option for turning the weapon back into a person. When the war is done with the hands that fought it, the state does not say thank you. It simply looks for a quiet place to drop the tools before they rust too loudly. The weight of the chainmail. You are 38 years old, but your ribs feel like old wicker and your knees move like ungreased hinges. For nearly 20 winters, your entire reality has been narrowed down to 3 things. The bitter bite of a leather shoulder strap cutting through your tunic. The greasy, iron smell of dried blood caking on your forearms. And the deafening, animal roar of men dying so close to your nose that you can taste the heat of their final breath. You have marched across distances that would make a seasoned merchant weep into his ledger. You have crossed frozen rivers in Hispania where the water turned your toes black. You have trekked through the blinding salt flats of Africa where your tongue swelled until it choked your throat. Your joints do not glide anymore, they grind. Every time you stand up from the dirt, your pelvis sends a sharp, sickening spike of heat straight up your spine. Your chest is a map of ancient violence. There is a jagged purple ditch over your left collarbone where a Gallic longsword found a gap in your shield wall. There is a small, puckered crater near your navel where a rebel spear tip broke off and stayed inside your meat for 3 weeks before a drunk surgeon yanked it out with iron pliers. Every square inch of the skin you own carries a story. But you cannot tell these stories to anyone in the civilian world. To them, it sounds like madness. To you, it is just the daily cost of staying alive. The Stymphalian nightmares. When you close your eyes, the world does not go dark. It turns into a slaughterhouse on an infinite repeat cycle. The nightmares do not feature mythical demons or gods from the old temples. They feature dates. They feature specific weather patterns. You close your eyes in a dry room in Italy, but your mind instantly drops you back into the damp pine forests of Germania in the autumn of the year 9. You smell the rotting moss. You feel the cold rain dripping down the back of your neck. And then the trap springs again. You see the front rank of your cohort disappear under a gray wave of screaming bodies. You see your tent mate, the man who ground his grain on the same hand mill as you for 7 years, get dragged into a thicket by his hair. You can still hear the wet, heavy thud of the clubs breaking his skull, a sound that has lived inside your ears for a decade and refuses to move out. The civilian population thinks war is a grand game of strategy played with colored stones on a table. They do not know what happens to a human brain when it spends 20 years watching men turn inside out. They do not understand the absolute weight of the silence that follows a shield wall collision. You are no longer a person who belongs to a family or a town. You have no wife that the Roman law recognizes. You have no son who can legally inherit your family name. You do not own a single patch of dirt that calls itself yours. You are a sharpened instrument that breathes. And the state does not love its instruments. It uses them until the edge goes dull, and then it looks for the next piece of iron. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The thin bronze line. The morning the world ends, there is no trumpet. There is no grand speech from the legate, and there are no flowers thrown at your feet by a grateful populace. The sky near the edge of the empire is the color of wet slate. A cold mist hangs over the drainage ditches of the fort. You stand in line, your hobnailed sandals sinking into the frozen mud, waiting for your turn at the paymaster's table. When your name is called, you step forward. A tribune with clean fingernails and a dry wool cloak does not look at your eyes. He looks at a wax tablet. He reaches into a wooden crate and presses a thin, cold bronze plaque into your open palm. Your discharge package. Your diploma. It is small enough to fit inside your fist, but it carries the weight of 20 years of industrial killing. The tribune claps you on the shoulder with a gesture he has repeated 500 times that morning. Behind him, a Syrian slave steps up to your back. The slave's fingers are quick and dispassionate. He undoes the iron buckles of your larica segmentata. He slides the heavy chainmail off your shoulders. For 19 years, that weight has been your second skin. It has shaped the muscles of your neck, it has compressed your vertebrae. When the iron slides off, your body does not feel light. It feels naked, exposed, and suddenly fragile. The wind hits the damp wool of your tunic, and you shiver. The tribune tells you the state has no further use for your body. He points toward the wooden gate of the fort. You step past the palisade, past the ditch, and out onto the gravel road that leads south toward Italy. The shape of silence. The moment the heavy oak gates thud shut behind you, a terrifying thing happens. The noise disappears. For your entire adult life, your ears have been filled with a specific, engineered noise. The rhythm of 5,000 men marching in step. The clatter of iron pots against wooden yokes. The shouting of centurions. The constant, comforting murmur of your tent mates sleeping 3 inches from your ears. Now, there is only the wind in the dry grass. It is a silence that has no shape, a vast, empty landscape where nobody is telling you where to dig, when to eat, or where to die. Your heart suddenly slams against your throat. A wave of pure panic hits you, more intense than the moment the shield wall cracked at Orazio. The truth arrives, late and brutal. Rome did not liberate you. Rome did not reward you. Rome simply switched you off. You are 38 years old, and you can gut a screaming barbarian before he can finish his war cry. Your muscles know exactly how many pounds of pressure it takes to drive a short sword through a leather cuirass and into a man's liver. But you cannot, for the life of you, remember how to buy bread in a market without an army clerk dock your pay for it. You do not know how to sit at a table with civilians who have never seen a man's brains spilled across a field. This is the part of the grand imperial history that the marble statues refuse to talk about. Every textbook wants to worship the cold brilliance of Caesar's campaigns, the white columns of the Forum glowing at dusk, and the disciplined lines of the standards. Nobody wants to open the door at the back of the slaughterhouse. Nobody wants to count the broken things that came out the other side. Because what do you do with the leftovers of the most disciplined killing operation the ancient world ever built? What happens to the hands when the war is finally done with them? The rot in the roots. While you were away bleeding in the pine forests of the north, the Republic was executing a very different kind of harvest at home. It was quiet, legal, and completely merciless. To understand why you have no home to return to, you have to understand the old rule that built the Roman army in the first place. For generations, the war machine rested on a single, unbroken concept: you could only wear the iron armor if you owned a piece of the dirt. The elders in the Senate used to say that a man with his own farm would bleed harder on the field because there was something tangible waiting for him at the end of the road. He wasn't just fighting for an abstract concept called Rome, he was fighting for the 3 acres of wheat that fed his children. It was a beautiful, clean idea. It worked perfectly when wars were local, fought against neighbors just 3 days' march down the road, ending well before the autumn harvest. But that system collapsed the moment Rome stopped fighting its neighbors and started swallowing the Mediterranean world whole. The state began shipping men across the seas. Hispania, Greece, Africa, Asia Minor. You didn't leave your farm for a season, you left it for 5, 7, or 10 years. Without your arms to hold the plow, the little family plots rotted into weeds. The wooden fences fell down. The roofs of the mud brick cottages collapsed under the winter rains. Your wife was forced to beg grain from distant cousins who had their own mouths to feed. Your children grew up in the dirt, learning their father's name not from his voice, but from a crude clay bust sitting on a dark shelf in the corner. The harvest of silver. And while the soldiers were away dying for the standards, the men with silver in their cellars began their own campaign. The wealthy patricians, the senators who stayed in Rome and grew fat on the grain monopolies, looked out at the thousands of abandoned farms across Italy and saw an opportunity. They moved in like vultures over a dying ox. They bought up the neglected plots for a handful of coins on the denarius, exploiting the desperation of wives who needed to buy bread that very week. If a family refused to sell, the boundaries were simply moved at night. The water rights were cut off. The small farms were bulldozed out of existence, their history flattened in an afternoon. The wealthy stitched these thousands of little family plots together into massive, sprawling industrial estates. The Romans called them latifundia. And to work these giant plantations, the rich did not hire free Roman citizens. That would cost money. Instead, they bought the millions of chained slaves brought back from the very wars you and your comrades had just finished fighting. So the veteran comes home to a brutal irony. The land he bled to expand has been used to erase his own home. The slaves he captured have replaced his own labor. You walk down the road of your childhood, and where your father's house used to stand, there is now an endless wall of gray stone, worked by foreign men in chains, guarded by thugs with whips. There is no home. There is no plot. There is no trade waiting for you. You have been evicted from your own country by the very wealth your blood created. The smoke and the chimney. When you have no dirt left to call your own, you drift. You do not do it because you want to, but because the geography of survival leaves you no other choice. You turn your back on the ruined fields of your youth and join the long, limping line of veterans walking toward the capital. You drift toward the city of Rome like smoke pulled toward a dark chimney. You enter through the southern gates and find yourself swallowed by a human swamp. This is not the Rome of the poets. This is the Subura, a screaming, suffocating maze of narrow alleys where the tenements are built 6 stories high out of cheap timber and crumbling concrete. The air here stinks of damp wheat going sour in the river warehouses and the greasy, choking smoke of thousands of cheap cooking fires fueled by animal fat. Here, you join a new social class that the ancient Roman law barely had a word for. The elite call you the capitensi, the head count. It is a clinical, insulting term. It means that when the government officials walk through the slums with their wax tablets to conduct the census, you have no property to declare. You have no horse, no farm, no silver, no slaves. The census takers do not weigh your worth, they simply count your skull. You are a number on a ledger of beggars. You have your skin, your scars, and nothing else. The panic in the marble. While the slums were filling up with the human wreckage of the provinces, the Senate chamber across the city was beginning to smell of cold sweat and panic. The Republic was facing a mathematical nightmare that it had no idea how to solve. For centuries, the entire Roman military strategy depended on landowners. But now, because the rich had devoured the small farms, the pool of eligible landowners had dried up. Rome had more territory than ever before, but it had no men left who met the legal property requirements to carry a shield. And then, the northern sky split completely open. A migrating nation, the Cimbri and the Teutons, came pouring down through the Alpine passes. They weren't an army, they were an entire people. Tens of thousands of warriors, women, children, heavy wooden wagons, and livestock. A mountain of iron and muscle moving south toward the Italian border. In 105 BC, at a place called Orazio on the banks of the Rhone River, they met the traditional Roman army. The Roman generals, arrogant and obsessed with social class, refused to cooperate with each other. The result was an industrial slaughter. In a single afternoon, 80,000 Roman legionaries were systematically butchered in the mud. The river ran red for miles. The shield walls didn't just crack, they were deleted from the map. The news hit the capital like a brick. Rome had no armies left. There were no veterans in reserve, no walls around the city, and no landowners left to draft. The Senate stood in the Forum, looking out at the crowds of unwashed, landless veterans sitting on the temple steps, and realized that the survival of the entire empire now depended on the very men they had spent decades ignoring. When the foundations of a house are rotten, you do not look for a philosopher to fix it, you look for a man who knows how to use an axe. With 80,000 bodies left to rot on the banks of the Rhone, the desperate politicians in Rome turned to a rough, unpolished general from the provinces named Gaius Marius. He did not come from the old senatorial families. He did not smell of perfumes or expensive oils, he smelled of leather, sweat, and iron. Marius walked through the crowded slums of the Subura, and where the elite saw only a human infection of beggars, he saw raw material. He climbed the stone steps of the rostra in the Forum, looked past the pale, terrified faces of the senators, and spoke directly to the thousands of landless veterans sitting in the dirt. He did not ask them for their property certificates. He did not check their financial status on a census ledger. He looked at their broad shoulders, their scarred arms, and their desperate eyes, and he made them a new kind of deal. "I will feed you," he promised. "I will clothe you in state wool. I will place a standardized iron sword in your hand. You will march where I point, you will kill who I tell you to kill, and when the campaign is done, I will hand you a parcel of land that you can pass down to your sons." To the starving men in the crowd, this was not a political speech, it was a line of rope thrown into a drowning pit. They stepped forward by the thousands to sign their names on his scrolls. And in that single collective step, without a single man realizing it, they snapped the spine of the Roman Republic forever. The sacred betrayal. Before the reforms of Marius, a soldier's loyalty belonged to the concept of Rome itself, to the Senate and the people. But these new landless recruits owed nothing to the Senate. The Senate had never fed them. The Senate had allowed their family farms to be stolen by chained slaves. These men loved only the commander who filled their iron cooking bowls and promised them a future. They raised their right hands and took the sacramentum, the military oath. It was a binding contract with religious weight that effectively dissolved their rights as free Roman citizens. From that moment on, they were state property with a pulse. A citizen had the right to a trial before a magistrate, a soldier had only the right to die where his general pointed. His commander could flog him until his skin hung in ribbons, crucify him on a hill, or behead him in front of the assembled ranks, and answer to no law for it. Marius turned these desperate men into the most terrifying infantry force the world had ever seen. They became known as Marius's mules, carrying 40 kilograms of iron rations, entrenching tools, and weapons on their backs across 20 miles of mountain passes every single day. They built a walled city out of earth and stakes every night, and they tore it down at dawn. But when the wars were won and the northern tribes were turned into mounds of bone, the bill arrived, and the Senate refused to pay it. The politicians in the Marble House argued that there was no public land left in Italy to give to these lower-class killers. So the generals did what men with legions always do when the politicians fail them. They stopped asking. In 88 BC, a warlord named Lucius Cornelius Sulla did the unthinkable. He ordered his veterans to turn their standards south and march on the city of Rome itself. The soldiers did not care about the sacred boundaries of the city. They did not care about the ancient laws written on bronze tablets. They cared about the silver in Sulla's pay chest and the land he promised to take for them. They poured into the streets, setting the wooden tenements on fire, hunting down political enemies through the Forum, and proving that the Republic was already a ghost. Power no longer lived in the voting assemblies, power lived in the hands of whoever controlled the veterans. By the time the civil wars finally burned themselves out in the mud, the Republic was a corpse that had been redressed in imperial robes. A young, cold-eyed master emerged from the wreckage, Octavian, who took the name Augustus and became the first true emperor of Rome. He sat at the center of an absolute power structure, controlling the grain ships of Egypt, the silver mines of Hispania, and the very lives of the men in the Senate. Yet, when Augustus unrolled his maps of Italy in his private quarters, his hands shook. The peninsula was crawling with hundreds of thousands of discharged, traumatized legionaries. They were old now, their joints ruined by thousands of miles of marching, their lungs choked with the soot of 100 frontier campfires. But their fingers still instinctively knew the exact grip of a short sword. Augustus understood a piece of political physics that many rulers after him would forget: a starving civilian will beg in the streets, but a starving veteran will organize. If he did not find a way to quiet these walking ghosts, they would remember their training, form into cohorts, and burn his empire to the ground brick by brick. To solve this, in AD 6, he established the Aerarium Militare, the first state pension system in Western history. It promised a massive lump sum of cash to every soldier who survived 20 years of service. On a bronze plaque, it looked like an act of supreme civic virtue. In the dark reality of the streets, it was institutional hush money. To fund it, Augustus had to squeeze the wealthy elite, slapping a 5% tax on all inheritances. The patricians were furious. They were being taxed, in their own minds, to pay the wine bills of unwashed, brutalized infantrymen who stank of the northern frontier. But Augustus didn't care about their feelings. He was trying to keep 3 inches of sharpened iron out of his own throat. The bureaucracy of death. But setting up the vault did not solve the daily nightmare of the veteran. The Roman state was a bureaucratic labyrinth run by men who loved paperwork more than their own flesh and blood. A soldier did not simply walk out of camp and receive his bag of silver. He was handed his bronze diploma, folded it into his tunic, and then began a second war, a paper war. He had to travel on foot across entire provinces to reach an imperial archive. He had to stand in line for days in a cool marble corridor that smelled of beeswax and old parchment, his ruined legs dragging behind him. When he finally reached the desk, he handed his tablet to a young clerk with soft, white hands who had never seen a man's belly ripped open by a spear. The clerk would turn the tablet over, check the list on his scrolls, and check the seals. If there was a single gap in the paper trail, a cohort record lost in a frontier fire, a missing signature from a centurion who died in an ambush 10 years prior, the clerk would slowly shake his head. Claim denied. Come back next month with witnesses. Next. The veteran could not draw his sword. Two fresh-faced Praetorian guards stood by the door with heavy javelins, ready to kill him before his feet could hit the courtyard steps. So he swallowed the humiliation. He walked out into the streets with empty pockets, sleeping on the cold stone steps of the temples, eating whatever rotted fruit fell off the back of a merchant's cart. The contrast inside the city walls became an abomination. The senators were carried through the streets in enclosed litters hoisted by foreign slaves, wearing silk dyed with Tyrian purple that cost its weight in silver. They ate roasted flamingo tongues and oysters packed in alpine snow while discussing philosophy under shaded porticos. And directly outside those same gates, within a spear's throw of the dining tables, sat the men who had bled to make that luxury possible. They sat in the mud, holding out their caps for coins, deliberately displaying their amputated limbs and jagged scar tissue as an unwritten, silent resume of their service. The civilian population didn't look at them with gratitude, they crossed the street with visible disgust. The veteran was a walking indictment, the physical evidence of the horrific cost of the empire everyone else was enjoying. In their final years, many of these broken men walked to a stonecutter's shop with their last pieces of silver to purchase their own tombstones in advance. Thousands of these stones have been pulled out of the dirt by modern archaeologists, and they all tell the same chilling story. The inscriptions begin with the traditional words, Dis manibus, to the spirits of the dead. But what follows is not a history of a human life. It is a cold, clipped military service record. Name. Legion. Century. Years of service. Campaigns survived. There is no mention of a trade, a friendship, a wife, a child, or a single moment of peace. There is no mention of what the man loved, or what he feared. When these men looked back across their entire existence on earth, the only part they found worth recording into permanent stone was the stretch of years during which they had been a state-owned killing tool. The civilian years didn't count. The starving years didn't count. They had stopped being human beings on the morning they took the military oath at 18. They had become weapons. And when the state was finally finished using them, they simply waited in the dark corners of the slums, without bitterness, without a family beside them, to turn back into the dust. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.